One of the hardest parts about creating a game in the modern era is getting it to stick. With how big gaming is, it's not impressive for a AAA company to get a game kickstarted with a big player base. But getting a game to keep that player base over time is a real challenge. And back in July of 2022, Multiversus attempted just that, eventually making it one of the most popular games of 2022. But if you've never heard of the game before, then you're not alone, because it fell into complete and total obscurity. This is the story of how one game managed to get 10 million players in a matter of months, and then lost everything just as quickly. This is the story of Multiversus. But first, let's go back to 2022 and look at what made Multiversus so popular in the first place. The biggest selling point of Multiversus was the idea of playing against a variety of characters from multiple different media outlets, casting a wide net of people that could get interested in it. And nothing shows that better than the fact that months before the game was even announced, there were rumors about the game's development and speculation about what it would look like. Some people have even theorized that the game had been in development for over 2 years starting in 2019 when Super Smash Bros. Ultimate was released. They even went as far to claim that the reason Space Jam 2 had so many crossovers was because of this very game. But while we have no definite information about whether these claims are true or not, one thing we can be sure of is that people were really interested in playing Multiversus. And it wasn't just the general public who were excited for this game as well. On October 27th of 2021, Hungrybox, one of the most successful professional Super Smash Bros. Players, made a Twitter post showing the character select screen of Multiversus. While this leak was important in its own right, what made it even better is that soon after the post was up, Hungrybox received a takedown request from Warner Brothers themselves. This only made the post appear more real and created even more hype for the project. And this wasn't the only leak about the game. There were confirmations about some characters like LeBron James even before the game was even announced, and internal design documents for the game were leaked on Reset Era. This led to even Game Informer eventually calling the game one of the worst kept secrets of the year. Ultimately, on November 18th, 2021, the game was finally announced, being hyped up as a fresh take on the 2v2 gameplay. Though, it didn't really need much hyping up when you consider the number of people excited about the release already. And for good reason too. Like many games, it had a purchasable pre-release version for the open beta, granting people access to the game a week before everyone else would get it. And while we don't have access to how many people purchased the pre-release version, it would be perfectly reasonable to assume that the number would have to be in the thousands considering how well the actual beta performed. On July 26th, when the beta was finally launched for everyone, the game instantly and completely took off. Within a month, it had 10 million players, and within 2 months, that number doubled to 20 million players. To give you an idea of how big that is, think about Elden Ring for a second. It was hyped up for years and was an amazing experience for long-term fans and first-time players alike. Elden Ring was definitively a success, having sold 13 million copies in its first month and reaching the 20 million mark a year after its launch. But Multiversus managed to get to 20 million in less than a third of that time. While these games are different genres, and the fact that Multiversus was free to play contributed a lot to its increased sales, 20 million copies sold in 2 months is considered legendary. By the end of its first night, it had reached a concurrent player count of over 140,000 players, putting it at the 4th spot ahead of games like Apex Legends and Rust. Its 24-hour peak stood at the 7th highest spot on Steam, leaving behind games like Destiny 2, Ark, and Team Fortress 2. And it was a big win for the people over at Warner Bros., considering it was their best performing game by a huge margin. Before Multiversus was released, the highest peak of a Warner Bros. Game was at 82,517 players, held by LEGO Star Wars. And it took Multiversus just 1 day to completely obliterate that record by reaching over 150,000 players. To give you an idea of just how successful Multiversus was for Warner Bros., the game's 1-day peak was higher than the combined peak of every Batman and Mortal Kombat game ever released. And even outside of Warner Bros., it had the highest peak of any fighting game released on Steam. This game was a huge success. And when the reviews started piling in, most of them were positive. IGN gave the verdict that the current state of the game was solid, and it had a very interesting premise. Given enough updates with new characters, it could even become a worthy competitor to Smash Bros. And the same thing was reiterated by Game Informer, that with more updates and with good character add-ons, it could easily become, quote, a crossover obsession for the years to come. But as both sides pointed out, the only way for it to keep growing is when you make more content. And Multiversus just didn't. By the time it was February 2023, more than 6 months after the game had launched, it would be an understatement to say that the game had mostly died. To give you an idea of how bad it was, the tracker for the Windows version of the game only reported 1,300 players in 30 full days, making it the lowest that the game has ever been. From September to February, it had lost most of its fanbase. But how did it get here? One of the biggest reasons behind the downfall of Multiversus was the extremely slow updates. Just consider the fact that the last character added to the game was Marvin the Martian back in November of 2022, after of which no new characters were added for 4 full months. When the game first launched, it had 17 characters and 6 more were added between August and November. So going from 6 new characters in 4 months to 0 new characters in that same time span caused people to get bored of the game and wanted to look for new experiences. And one of the worst side effects of this was that as players were getting more bored of the gameplay, they started to notice more faults in the gameplay. A lot of the game felt unpolished, and looking at the game in its entirety, many people felt like it was still just an early access version instead of being the final game. But the thing is, that's exactly what it was. I mentioned before too that July 26th was the launch of just the beta, not the final game. There never was an official launch of Multiversus, because it's remained in beta this entire time. And while it had reached 20 million players, Warner Bros. Had barely made any money off of the game. Ultimately, the game cost $0 to play, which meant that no matter how many people played it, only a fraction would actually buy the in-game currency and provide revenue to the company. And while we have no official information on how much the company earned from in-game purchases, we do know that it couldn't have been much considering that it wasn't even in the top 20 best-selling games of 2022. In comparison, some other Warner Bros. Games like LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga were doing much better in terms of revenue. And coming back to the Elden Ring comparison I made earlier in the video, while both games had gotten over 20 million players, only Elden Ring had made millions of dollars in profit to go along with it. So when Warner Bros. Saw that their game, which was already barely generating any revenue, was now falling into ruin and had lost 99% of its player base, they decided to make a decision that would come as a shock to the 1% of people that still played the game religiously. It would be closing the beta on June 25th, less than a year after its release. And what makes this even worse was that it offered no refunds to the players who had bought their in-game currency, thinking that the game was fully released. Though this didn't mean that the story of Multiversus was at an end. With the announcement of the beta being closed came another announcement of the actual game being released fully in 2024. But even this announcement was forgotten pretty quickly, just like the rest of the game. After all, when there's games like Baldur's Gate 3 and Lethal Company right on the horizon, who would remember a game like this? Be that as it may, a lot of the fighting game community still held the game in high regard. Just a couple of weeks ago, on March 5th, the Multiversus Twitter account made its first post since June of 2023. And that post absolutely blew up, standing at 5 million views at the time of writing this. And most of the responses on that post were positive, talking about how excited people were to get back into the game and play as some of their favorite characters. Many people were even hopeful that they would be able to keep the skins that they had grinded for or purchased in the past. Soon after that, on March 11th, they announced the official date of launch on March 28th, and even mentioned something called the Illudium Q36 Explosive Space Modulator. A lot to say, I know. While we have little information about what it actually is as of now, that, combined with the fact that this game will run on Unreal Engine 5, means that it would look a lot more polished and would feel much better than the beta version. And the entire reason behind the beta being shut down was that it would give the company time to work on new updates and characters. Overall, the upcoming release of Multiversus is already gearing up to be just as good as the release of its beta, and it might even give Riot's new fighting game some competition. But the battle is just getting started for Multiversus, and while it will definitely get a lot of initial hype, whether it can maintain that hype for years to come is something that remains to be seen. If you enjoyed watching, be sure to check out some of the other videos on our channel, and consider liking and subscribing.